When we talk about corruption, there are typical types of individuals that spring to mind. There's the former Soviet megalomaniacs. And then there's that cliché, the African dictator or minister or official. It's easy to think that corruption happens somewhere kind of over there, carried out by a bunch of greedy despots and individuals up to no good in countries that we personally may know very little about and feel really unconnected to and unaffected by what might be going on. But does it just happen over there? Well, at 22, I was very lucky. My first job out of university was investigating the illegal trade in African ivory. And that's how my relationship with corruption really began. We set up an organisation called Global Witness. Our first campaign was investigating the role of illegal logging in funding the war in Cambodia. A few years later, I'm in Angola, undercover, investigating blood diamonds. Perhaps you saw the Hollywood film Blood Diamond, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, some of that sprang from our work. I'm sitting in a hot and very stuffy hotel room, feeling totally overwhelmed. But it wasn't about blood diamonds, because I'd been speaking to lots of people who talked about a different problem, that of a massive web of corruption on a global scale and millions of oil dollars going missing. For a very small organisation of just a few people, trying to even begin to think how we might tackle that was an enormous challenge. And in the years that I've been campaigning and investigating, I've repeatedly seen that what makes corruption on a global, massive scale possible, it isn't just greed or the misuse of power or that nebulous phrase, weak governance. I mean, yes, it's all of those. But corruption, it's made possible by the actions of global facilitators. Some of those people we've investigated, and they're all people who couldn't do what they do alone, without help, with global banks. A bank in Paris held accounts of companies controlled by American banks. They funneled $73 million into the States. He didn't do all this in his own name either. Used shell companies, used one to buy the property and another, which was in somebody else's name, to pay the huge bills it cost to run the place. Oil minister awarded an oil block now worth over $1 billion to a company that he was the hidden owner of. Then later traded on with the kind assistance of the Nigerian government to subsidiaries of Shell and the Italian Eni, two of the biggest oil companies around. So the reality is that the engine of corruption, it exists far beyond the shores of countries like Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria or Turkmenistan. This engine, it's driven by our international banking system, by the problem of anonymous shell companies, by the secrecy that we have afforded big oil, gas and mining operations, and, most of all, by the failure of our politicians to back up their rhetoric and do something really meaningful and systemic to tackle this stuff. Now let's take the banks first. Banks accept dirty money, but they prioritise their profits in other destructive ways too. For example, in Sarawak, Malaysia, it has just 5% of its forests left intact. So how did that happen? Because an elite and its facilitators have been making millions of dollars from supporting logging on an industrial scale for many years. So we sent an undercover investigator in to secretly film meetings with members of the ruling elite. The resulting footage made some people very angry, and you can see that on YouTube, but it proved what we had long suspected, because it showed how the state's chief minister, despite his later denials, used his control over land and forest licenses to enrich himself and his family. We know that HSBC bankrolled the region's largest logging companies that were responsible for some of that destruction in Sarawak and elsewhere. The bank violated its own sustainability policies in the process, but it earned around $130 million. Very shortly after our expose, the bank announced a policy review on this. And then there's the problem of anonymous shell companies. We all know they're used quite a bit by people and companies who are trying to avoid paying their proper dues to society, also known as taxes. But what doesn't usually come to light is how shell companies are used to steal huge sums of money, transformational sums of money from poor countries. In virtually every case of corruption that we've investigated, shell companies have appeared, and sometimes it's been impossible to find out who was really involved in the deal. A recent study by the World Bank looked at 200 cases of corruption. It found that over 70% of those cases had used anonymous shell companies, totaling almost $56 billion. Many of these companies were in America and the United Kingdom, its overseas territories and crown dependencies, and so it's not just an offshore problem, it's an onshore one too. You see, shell companies, they're central to the secret deals which may benefit wealthy elites rather than ordinary citizens. One striking recent case that we've investigated is how the government in the Democratic Republic of Congo sold off a series of valuable state-owned mining assets to shell companies in the British Virgin Islands. So we spoke to sources in country, trawled through company documents and other information, trying to piece together a really true picture of the deal. And we were alarmed to find that these shell companies had quickly flipped many of the assets on for huge profits to major international mining companies listed in London. The Africa Progress Panel calculated that Congo may have lost more than $1.3 billion from these deals. So that's almost twice the country's annual health and education budget combined. And will the people of Congo, will they ever get their money back? The answer to that question, and who was really involved and what really happened, that's going to probably remain locked away in the secretive company registries of the British Virgin Islands and elsewhere, unless we all do something about it. There's a lot at stake. In 2011, natural resource exports outweighed aid flows by almost 19 to 1 in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. 19 to 1. That's a hell of a lot of schools and universities and hospitals and business startups, many of which haven't materialized and never will because some of that money has simply been stolen away. On the surface, the deal appeared straightforward. Subsidiaries of Shell and Eni paid the Nigerian government for the block. The Nigerian government transferred precisely the same amount to the very dollar to an account earmarked for a shell company whose hidden owner was a convicted money launderer. After many months of digging around and reading through hundreds of pages of court documents, we found evidence that, in fact, Shell and Eni had known that the funds would be transferred to that shell company. And frankly, it's hard to believe they didn't know who they were really dealing with there. It just shouldn't take these sort of efforts to find out where the money in deals like this went. These are state assets. They're supposed to be used for the benefit of the people in the country. But in some countries, citizens and journalists who are trying to expose stories like this have been harassed and arrested, and some have even risked their lives to do so. There are those who believe that corruption is unavoidable. It's just how some business is done. It's too complex and difficult to change. So in effect, we just accept it. But as a campaigner and investigator, I have a different view because I've seen what can happen when an idea gains momentum. In the oil and mining sector, for example, there is now the beginning of a truly worldwide transparency standard that could tackle some of these problems. In 1999, when Global Witness called for oil companies to make payments on deals transparent, some people laughed at the extreme naivety of that small idea. But literally hundreds of civil society groups from around the world came together to fight for transparency, and now it's fast becoming the norm and the law. 2/3 of the value of the world's oil and mining companies are now covered by transparency laws. 2/3. So this is change happening. This is progress. But we're not there yet by far, because it really isn't about corruption somewhere over there, is it? In a globalized world, corruption is a truly globalized business, and one that needs global solutions supported and pushed by us all as global citizens, right here. Thank you. I've come here today to talk to you about a problem. It's a very simple yet devastating problem, one that spans the globe and is affecting all of us. The problem is anonymous companies. Anonymous companies are making it difficult and sometimes impossible to find out the actual human beings responsible for really terrible crimes. So, why am I here? I guess I'm a lifelong troublemaker, and when my parents taught my twin brother and I to question authority, I don't think they knew where it might lead. And they probably really regretted it during my stroppy teenage years when, predictably, I questioned their authority a lot. And a lot of my school teachers didn't appreciate it much either. You see, since the age of about 5, I've always asked the question, but why? But why does the earth go round the sun? But why is blood red? But why do I have to go to school? But why do I have to respect the teachers and authority? And little did I realize that this question would become the basis of everything I would do. From that crazy question, Global Witness is now an 80-strong team of campaigners, investigators, journalists, and lawyers. And we're all driven by the same belief that change really is possible. So what exactly does Global Witness do? We investigate. We report to uncover the people really responsible for funding conflict, for stealing millions from citizens around the world, also known as state looting, and for destroying the environment. And then we campaign hard to change the system itself. And we're doing this because so many of the countries rich in natural resources like oil or diamonds or timber are home to some of the poorest and most dispossessed people on the planet. And much of this injustice is made possible by currently accepted business practices. And one of these is anonymous companies. We've come up against anonymous companies in lots of our investigations, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we exposed how secretive deals involving anonymous companies had deprived the citizens of one of the poorest countries on the planet of well over $1 billion. That's twice the country's health and education budget combined. Or in Liberia, where an international predatory logging company used front companies as it attempted to grab a really huge chunk of Liberia's unique forests. Or political corruption in Sarawak, Malaysia, which has led to the destruction of much of its forests. That uses anonymous companies too. We secretly filmed some of the family of the former chief minister and a lawyer as they told our undercover investigator exactly how these dubious deals are done using such companies. And the awful thing is, there are so many other examples. This truly is a scandal of epic proportions, hidden in plain sight. Or the anonymous company, which bought up Americans' tax debts, piled on the legal fees, and then gave homeowners a choice: pay up or lose your home. Imagine being threatened with losing your home, sometimes over a debt of just a few $100s, and not being able to find out who you were really up against. Now, anonymous companies are great for sanctions busting too, as the Iranian government found out when, through a series of front companies, it owned a building in the very heart of Manhattan on Fifth Avenue, despite American sanctions. Anonymous companies have even come to light in the recent revolution in the Ukraine. But for every case that we and others expose, there are so many more that will remain hidden away because of the current system. And it's just a simple truth that some of the people responsible for outrageous crimes, for stealing from you and me and millions of others, they are remaining faceless, and they are escaping accountability, and they're doing this with ease, and they're doing it using legal structures. You might well ask, what exactly is an anonymous company? And can I really set one up and use it without anyone knowing who I am? The answer is yes, you can. So let me show you. First, you need to work out where you want to set it up. At this point, you might be imagining one of those lovely tropical island tax havens. But here's the thing. Shockingly, my own hometown, London, and indeed the UK, is one of the best places in the world to set up an anonymous company. And the other, even better, that's America. In some states across America, you need less identification to open up a company than you do to get a library card. And now you can simply go online and find yourself a company service provider. These are the companies that can set your one up for you. And remember, it's all legal, routine business practice. So here's one, but there's plenty of others to choose from. And having made your choice, you then pick what type of company you want, and then fill in a contact, name and address. But don't worry, it doesn't have to be your name. It could be your lawyer's or your service provider's. And it's not for the public record anyway. And then you add the owner of the company. Now this is the key part. And again, it doesn't have to be you, because you can get creative, because there is a whole universe out there of nominees to choose from. And nominees are the people that you can legally pay to be your company's owner. And if you don't want to involve anyone else, it doesn't even have to be an actual human being. It could be another company. And then finally, give your company a name, add a few more details, and make your payment. And then the service provider will take a few hours or more to process it. But there you are. In 10 minutes of online shopping, you can create yourself an anonymous company. And not only is it easy, really, really easy, and cheap, it's totally legal too. But the fun doesn't have to end there. Maybe you want to be even more anonymous. Well, that's no problem either. You can simply keep adding layers. Companies owned by companies. You can have hundreds of layers with hundreds of companies spread across lots of different countries, like a giant web. Each layer adds anonymity. Each layer makes it more difficult for law enforcement and others to find out who the real owner is. But whose interests is this all serving? It might be in the interests of the company or a particular individual, but what about all of us, the public? There hasn't even been a global conversation yet about whether it's okay to misuse companies in this way. And what does it all mean for us? Well, an example that really haunts me is one I came across recently, and it's that of a horrific fire in a nightclub in Buenos Aires about a decade ago. Over 200 people died, 700 were injured trying to get out. Investigators tried to find out who was responsible. And as they looked for the owners of the club, they found instead anonymous companies, and confusion surrounded the identities of those involved with the companies. This was an awful tragedy, and it shouldn't have been so difficult just to try and find out who was responsible for those deaths. Because in an age when there is so much information out there in the open, why should this crucial information about company ownership stay hidden away? Why should tax evaders, corrupt government officials, arms traders, and more be able to hide their identities from us, the public? Why should this secrecy be such an accepted business practice? Anonymous companies might be the norm right now, but it wasn't always this way. Companies were created to limit financial risk. They were never intended to be used as a moral shield. Companies were never intended to be anonymous, and they don't have to be. And so I come to my wish. My wish is for us to know who owns and controls companies so that they can no longer be used anonymously against the public good. Together, let's ignite world opinion, change the law, and launch a new era of openness in business. So what might this look like? Imagine if you could go online and look up the real owner of a company. Imagine if this data were open and free, accessible across borders, for citizens and businesses and law enforcement alike. Imagine what a game changer that would be. So how are we going to do this? Well, there's only one way. Together, we have to change the law globally to create public registries which list the true owners of companies and can be accessed by all with no loopholes. And yes, this is ambitious, but there is momentum on this issue. And over the years, I have seen the sheer power of momentum, and it's just starting on this issue. There is such an opportunity right now. Community of creative and innovative thinkers and doers across all of society could make the crucial difference. You really can make this change happen. A simple starting point is the address behind me for a Facebook page that you can join now to support the campaign and spread the word. It's going to be a springboard for global campaigning. And the techies among you, you could really help us create a prototype public registry to demonstrate what a powerful tool this could be. Campaign groups from around the world have come together to work on this issue. The UK government is already on board. It supports these public registries. And just last week, the European Parliament came on board with a vote 600 to 30 in favour of public registries. That is momentum. But it's early days. America still needs to come on board, as do so many other countries. And to succeed, we will all together need to help and push our politicians, because without that, real, far-reaching, world-shifting change just isn't going to happen. Because this isn't just about changing the law. This is about starting a conversation about what it's okay for companies to do, and in what ways is it acceptable to use company structures. This isn't just a dry policy issue. This is a human issue which affects us all. This is about being on the right side of history. Global citizens, innovators, business leaders, individuals, we need you. Together, let's kickstart this global movement. Let's just do it. Let's end anonymous companies. Thank you.